The morning sun barely broke through the thick forest canopy as Sarah Chen adjusted her position behind the fallen oak tree. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold mountain air, and she could feel the dampness seeping through her camouflage gear. She had been lying in this spot for 3 hours, waiting for any sign of movement from the enemy camp below. Sarah was not supposed to be here. According to her commanding officer, she should have been back at base camp helping with communication duties. But when the reconnaissance team failed to return from their mission, someone had to take action. The enemy had been advancing through the mountain pass for days, getting closer to the civilian evacuation routes with each passing hour. She pressed her eye to the scope of her rifle and scanned the valley below. The military-grade scope allowed her to see details clearly even at great distances. Through the lens, she could make out several figures moving between the abandoned buildings of what used to be a small mountain village. The enemy had set up a temporary command post there, using the village as a strategic point to control the mountain pass. Sarah counted at least 12 soldiers moving around the buildings. They seemed relaxed, probably thinking they were safe in their remote location. Little did they know that someone was watching their every move from the ridge above. She made mental notes of their positions, their equipment, and their patrol patterns. Her radio crackled softly in her ear. "Mountain Bird, this is base. What's your status?" The voice belonged to Lieutenant Martinez, her squad leader who probably had no idea she had left her assigned position. Sarah hesitated before responding. If she revealed her location, she would certainly face disciplinary action. But if she stayed silent, valuable intelligence about enemy positions would be lost. She made her decision. "Base, this is Mountain Bird. I have eyes on enemy positions in the valley, counting 12 hostiles, possibly more inside buildings. They've established a command post in the abandoned village." There was a long pause before Martinez responded. "Mountain Bird, confirm your position. You're supposed to be at Communication Post 7. Negative, base. I'm on Overwatch position, ridgeline above Target Valley. The recon team never made it back. Someone needed to gather intelligence." Another pause, longer this time. Sarah could imagine the heated discussion happening back at base camp. Finally, Martinez's voice came through again, and she could hear both anger and reluctant respect in his tone. "Mountain Bird, maintain position and continue observation. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. We're sending backup to your location." Sarah smiled grimly. She had bought herself some time, but she knew there would be consequences later. For now, her focus needed to be on the mission at hand. The enemy soldiers below were not just random fighters. Based on their equipment and disciplined movements, these were elite troops, probably special forces. As she continued her observation, Sarah noticed something troubling. The soldiers were setting up what looked like long-range communication equipment. If they succeeded in establishing communication with their main force, they could coordinate a massive attack on the evacuation routes. Hundreds of innocent civilians would be trapped. The wind began to pick up, carrying with it a thick mist from the valley below. Sarah had seen this weather pattern before in these mountains. Within an hour, the entire area would be covered in dense fog, making visibility nearly impossible. This could work to her advantage, or it could make her mission much more dangerous. She checked her equipment one more time. Her rifle was a precision instrument, capable of accurate shots at extreme distances. She had trained with it for years, becoming one of the best marksmen in her unit. But hitting targets in heavy mist would test even her considerable skills. Through her scope, she watched as the enemy soldiers worked frantically to complete their communication setup. They must have noticed the approaching mist as well, and were trying to establish contact before visibility dropped to 0. Sarah realized she was running out of time. Her radio crackled again. "Mountain Bird, be advised that backup is still 2 hours out. Weather conditions are slowing their approach. 2 hours. Sarah looked at the advancing mist and then back at the enemy soldiers below. In 2 hours, they would either have completed their mission or disappeared into the fog. She would have to make a decision soon. As she weighed her options, Sarah thought about her training. She had joined the military to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. She had spent countless hours learning to be a precise, effective soldier. All of that training had led to this moment, alone on a mountain ridge, with the safety of hundreds of civilians depending on her actions. The mist continued to advance up the valley walls, getting thicker and more dense. Soon it would reach her position on the ridge. Sarah made a mental calculation of wind speed, distance, and the time she had left before visibility became impossible. She adjusted her rifle's scope settings and checked her ammunition. Each shot would have to count. There would be no room for error once she revealed her position. The enemy soldiers below were well trained and would respond quickly to any threat. Sarah took a deep breath and settled into her shooting position. The mist was now only a few hundred meters below her position and rising fast. In a few minutes, she would have to make her move. Everything depended on timing, precision, and a little bit of luck. As she prepared for what might be the most important mission of her career, Sarah thought about the civilians evacuating through the mountain passes. She thought about her fellow soldiers who depended on her intelligence. Most of all, she thought about the responsibility that came with her skills and training. The enemy soldiers below continued their work, unaware that their every move was being watched by a skilled marksman hidden in the rocks above. The advancing mist created an eerie atmosphere, muffling sounds and creating strange shadows in the valley below. Sarah knew that in a few minutes, she would have to step into that mist and face whatever consequences came with her decision. But for now, she watched and waited, gathering every piece of information that might help her complete her mission successfully. The mist reached Sarah's position faster than she had anticipated. Within minutes, the thick white clouds had swallowed the entire valley, reducing visibility to just a few meters. Through her scope, she could barely make out the shadowy outlines of the buildings below. The enemy soldiers had disappeared completely into the fog. Sarah cursed under her breath. The weather had taken away her advantage of long-range observation, but it had also given her something else, the perfect cover for a closer approach. If she could move down into the valley without being detected, she might be able to gather more detailed intelligence about their operations. She carefully packed her rifle into its carrying case and secured it to her back. Moving through thick mist required different skills than long-range shooting. Sarah had trained for this too, learning how to move silently through difficult terrain while maintaining awareness of her surroundings. The descent into the valley was treacherous. Loose rocks and wet vegetation made every step dangerous. Sarah had to feel her way down the steep slope, using her hands to steady herself against trees and boulders. The mist was so thick that she couldn't see her own feet, let alone any obstacles in her path. As she moved lower, Sarah began to hear voices. The enemy soldiers were still working on their communication equipment, and the mist that blocked her vision also carried sound in strange ways. Sometimes the voices seemed to come from directly in front of her, other times from completely different directions. Sarah paused every few steps to listen and orient herself. She needed to locate the enemy positions without walking directly into them. The abandoned village had several buildings, and she needed to figure out which ones were occupied and which ones might provide good observation points. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Sarah reached the valley floor. The mist was even thicker here, creating an almost otherworldly atmosphere. She could hear the enemy soldiers more clearly now, and their voices told her they were frustrated with their equipment problems. "The signal keeps cutting out," one voice complained in a language Sarah recognized but didn't speak fluently. "This fog is interfering with everything." "Keep trying," another voice responded, this one with more authority. "Command is expecting our report within the hour." Sarah smiled grimly. The same mist that was making her mission more difficult was also causing problems for the enemy. She began to move carefully toward the voices, using the sound to guide her through the fog. The abandoned village was larger than it had appeared from the ridge. Sarah counted at least 6 buildings, ranging from small houses to what looked like an old community center. The enemy had clearly chosen this location for its strategic value, but they hadn't expected the weather to turn against them. As she moved between the buildings, Sarah began to piece together the enemy's deployment. Most of the soldiers seemed to be concentrated around the largest building, probably using it as their command center. A few others were positioned as sentries around the perimeter. But the thick mist was making their job nearly impossible. Sarah found what she was looking for, an abandoned house with a clear view of the command center. The building was dark and appeared empty, but she approached it carefully anyway. In this kind of weather, assumptions could be deadly. The house had been abandoned for months, maybe years. Dust covered everything, and the air smelled stale and musty. But it provided excellent cover and, more importantly, had windows that faced the enemy command center. Sarah positioned herself near a broken window on the second floor and unpacked her rifle. From this new position, she could see much more than she had from the ridge. The enemy soldiers had set up sophisticated communication equipment, including satellite dishes and multiple radio units. This was definitely more than a simple patrol. This was a major intelligence operation. Through her scope, Sarah could make out details that changed everything. The soldiers weren't just trying to coordinate an attack on the evacuation routes. They were intercepting communications from Sarah's own forces, gathering intelligence about troop movements and civilian evacuation plans. Sarah's radio crackled softly in her ear. "Mountain Bird, this is base. What's your status?" "We've lost visual contact with your position." Sarah hesitated. If she responded, the enemy might be able to intercept her transmission and locate her position. But if she remained silent, her own forces would assume she was lost or captured. She made a difficult decision and switched her radio to a rarely used emergency frequency. "Base, this is Mountain Bird on emergency channel. Enemy forces are intercepting our communications. Repeat, they have intelligence gathering capabilities. Change all frequencies immediately." The response came back quickly. "Mountain Bird, confirm your position and status. I'm in close observation of enemy command center. They have advanced equipment, probably Special Forces Intelligence Unit. I count at least 12 hostiles, possibly more. They're trying to establish satellite communication with their command." As Sarah transmitted this information, she noticed increased activity around the command center. The enemy soldiers were moving with more urgency, and she could see them adjusting their equipment. Her transmission had definitely been noticed, even on the emergency frequency. Suddenly, the mist began to thin slightly. Sarah could see more of the village layout, but this also meant that the enemy soldiers could see better too. She watched as several soldiers spread out from the command center, clearly searching for the source of the radio transmission. Sarah realized her position was no longer safe. The enemy knew someone was watching them, and they would search every building until they found her. She had two choices: retreat back to the ridge and lose the opportunity to gather more intelligence, or stay and risk capture. As she weighed her options, Sarah noticed something that made her decision for her. One of the enemy soldiers was carrying what looked like a portable jamming device. If they succeeded in setting it up, they could block all radio communications in the area, preventing Sarah's forces from coordinating their response to the threat. The soldier with the jamming device was moving toward a position that would give him coverage of the entire valley. Sarah calculated the distance and wind conditions. It was a difficult shot, made more challenging by the mist and the fact that she would have to fire from inside a building. But it was a shot she could make, and if she could disable their jamming capability, it might buy her forces enough time to respond properly to the intelligence threat. Sarah settled into her shooting position and began to line up the shot. The mist swirled around the valley, sometimes clearing enough to give her a perfect view of her target, other times obscuring everything completely. Sarah would have to time her shot perfectly, waiting for a moment when the fog cleared and her target was visible. As she prepared to take the shot that would reveal her position to every enemy soldier in the valley, Sarah thought about her training and the importance of her mission. Sometimes a soldier had to take risks to protect others, even when those risks seemed overwhelming. The mist cleared for a moment, and Sarah saw her target clearly through the scope. Sarah's finger rested on the trigger as she watched the soldier with the jamming device through her scope. The mist swirled around him like ghostly fingers, sometimes hiding him completely, other times revealing him in perfect clarity. She had trained for shots like this countless times, but never under these exact conditions. The soldier stopped near a tall radio antenna and began setting up his equipment. Sarah could see him clearly now, a tall man in dark combat gear moving with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. He was completely unaware that a sniper had him in her crosshairs. Sarah controlled her breathing just as she had been taught. Inhale slowly, exhale halfway, hold and squeeze the trigger gently. The shot had to be perfect. Not only did she need to stop the jamming device, but she also needed to do it without giving away her exact position to the other soldiers. The mist cleared again, and Sarah took her shot. The sound echoed strangely in the fog, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Through her scope, she saw the soldier with the jamming device collapse. The equipment scattered across the ground, clearly damaged and unusable. Immediately, the valley erupted into activity. Enemy soldiers began shouting orders and running toward the sound of the gunshot. But the thick mist and the echo effect made it impossible for them to pinpoint exactly where the shot had come from. Sarah quickly moved away from the window and repositioned herself on the other side of the house. She had bought herself some time, but not much. The enemy soldiers would search every building systematically until they found her. Through a different window, she could see soldiers moving through the mist like shadows. They were well-trained and disciplined, spreading out in a search pattern that would eventually cover the entire village. Sarah counted at least 8 soldiers actively searching for her, while others remained at the command center to protect their equipment. Her radio crackled with activity. "Mountain Bird, we heard gunfire. What's your status?" Sarah switched to the emergency frequency again. "Base, I've engaged enemy forces, successfully disabled their jamming capability, but my position is compromised. Enemy soldiers are conducting active search. Mountain Bird, backup is still 90 minutes out. Can you evade until then?" Sarah looked out at the searching soldiers in the thick mist that was her only protection. 90 minutes seemed like a lifetime under these circumstances. "I'll try, Base, continuing mission." She moved quietly through the abandoned house looking for the best escape route. The building had a back door that led to a small garden area, mostly hidden by overgrown vegetation. If she could reach the garden without being seen, she might be able to move to another building or even escape back to the ridge. As Sarah prepared to leave the house, she heard footsteps on the front porch. The enemy soldiers had reached her building and were preparing to search it. She could hear them talking quietly, coordinating their approach. They knew someone was inside. Sarah had seconds to decide. She could try to slip out the back door and risk being seen by other search teams, or she could stay and fight from inside the house. Neither option was ideal, but staying meant being trapped if more soldiers arrived. She chose to move. Carefully opening the back door, Sarah slipped into the overgrown garden. The thick vegetation provided some cover, but the mist was beginning to thin again, making concealment more difficult. Behind her, she heard the soldiers entering the house. They moved room by room, checking every possible hiding place. It wouldn't take them long to realize she had escaped through the back. Sarah moved through the garden and reached a low stone wall that separated the house from the next building. As she climbed over the wall, she heard shouts from the house behind her. The soldiers had discovered her escape route and were now pursuing her. The next building was smaller than the first, just a simple 2-story house with broken windows and a partially collapsed roof. Sarah slipped inside and immediately began looking for a defensive position. If the soldiers found her here, she would have to fight her way out. From a second-floor window, Sarah could see the command center clearly. The enemy soldiers there were packing up their equipment, probably preparing to move to a new location. If they succeeded in relocating, all the intelligence she had gathered would be useless. Sarah made a quick decision. Instead of continuing to run, she would take one more shot. The commanding officer at the communications center was clearly directing the entire operation. If she could eliminate him, it might disrupt their mission long enough for her backup to arrive. She set up her rifle near the broken window and began scanning for targets. The mist was thinner now, giving her better visibility but also making her more vulnerable to detection. Through her scope, she could see the enemy commander clearly, a middle-aged man with gray hair, wearing the insignia of a senior officer. But as Sarah lined up her shot, she heard footsteps on the stairs below her. The search team had tracked her to this building and was coming up to her floor. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached her position. Sarah faced an impossible choice. She could take the shot at the enemy commander and risk being captured or killed by the soldiers below, or she could abandon the shot and try to escape again. The footsteps were getting closer. Sarah could hear the soldiers communicating in whispers, coordinating their approach to her floor. They knew exactly where she was now. Through her scope, she could see the enemy commander giving orders to his men. He was organizing the evacuation of their equipment and the continuation of their mission. If he succeeded, the intelligence threat to Sarah's forces would continue. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Sarah estimated she had less than 10 seconds before the soldiers reached her room. She had to choose now, take the shot or run. Sarah made her decision. She lined up the shot on the enemy commander, controlled her breathing, and prepared to fire. The sound would definitely give away her position to the soldiers in the building, but it might also complete her mission. As the door to her room began to open, Sarah took the shot. Through her scope, she saw the enemy commander fall. The command center erupted into chaos as soldiers rushed to help their fallen leader. But Sarah's problems were just beginning. The soldiers in the building with her had heard the gunshot and knew exactly where it came from. She could hear them rushing toward her room, and there was nowhere left to run. Sarah quickly packed her rifle and moved toward the only remaining option, a window that led to the roof of an adjacent building. It was a dangerous jump, made more treacherous by the mist and wet conditions, but it was her only chance. As the enemy soldiers burst into her room, Sarah was already diving through the window toward the neighboring rooftop. Behind her, she heard shouts and the sound of automatic weapons fire, but she was already committed to her desperate escape attempt. The jump was longer than she had calculated, and Sarah barely managed to grab the edge of the other roof. She pulled herself up just as more gunfire erupted from the window she had just left. The enemy soldiers were now fully aware of her position and capabilities, but Sarah had accomplished something important. The enemy commander was down, their jamming device was destroyed, and their mission was in chaos. Now she just had to survive long enough for her backup to arrive. Sarah pulled herself onto the rooftop just as bullets shattered the tiles around her. The enemy soldiers were firing from the window she had just escaped, but the mist and distance made their shots inaccurate. Still, she couldn't stay exposed on the roof for long. She crawled across the wet tiles toward the far edge of the building, trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and her pursuers. The roof was slippery from the moisture in the air, and every movement had to be careful and deliberate to avoid making noise or losing her footing. Behind her, Sarah could hear the soldiers organizing. They were shouting orders and coordinating their search. Some were staying in the building to secure it, while others were moving to surround the area where she had landed. They were treating this like a military operation, which meant they would be systematic and thorough. Sarah reached the edge of the roof and looked down. Below was a narrow alley between buildings, partially filled with old equipment and debris from the abandoned village. It was at least a 15-foot drop, but the alley would provide cover from the searching soldiers. As she prepared to climb down, Sarah heard a new sound that made her blood run cold, the distinctive whirring of a helicopter approaching. The enemy had called for air support, and once that helicopter arrived with its thermal imaging capabilities, the mist would no longer provide adequate concealment. Sarah quickly rappelled down the side of the building using a rope from her equipment pack. The alley was darker than the surrounding area, filled with shadows that the mist made even deeper. She moved carefully through the debris, looking for a way out of the village that wouldn't expose her to the searching soldiers. The helicopter sound was getting louder. Sarah estimated she had maybe 5 minutes before it arrived, and began systematic sweeps of the area. She needed to find better cover or a way to eliminate the air threat. As she moved through the alley, Sarah discovered something unexpected, an old storm drain that led under the village. The entrance was partially hidden by fallen debris, but it looked large enough for her to crawl through. More importantly, it would be invisible to thermal imaging from above. Sarah squeezed into the storm drain just as she heard the helicopter arrive overhead. The sound echoed strangely through the underground tunnel, sometimes loud, sometimes fading to almost nothing. She began crawling through the tunnel, using her hands to feel her way in the complete darkness. The tunnel was wet and cramped, but it seemed to run parallel to the main street of the village. If Sarah could follow it far enough, she might be able to emerge outside the search perimeter and make her way back to the ridge. Above her, she could hear the helicopter making systematic sweeps. The sound would get louder as it passed directly overhead, then fade as it moved to other areas. The soldiers on the ground were also active, calling out search patterns and positions. After crawling for what felt like an hour but was probably only 20 minutes, Sarah saw light ahead. The tunnel ended at another storm drain outlet, this one at the far edge of the village. She carefully approached the opening and listened for any sounds of nearby enemy soldiers. The area seemed quiet, but Sarah knew that could change quickly. She emerged from the tunnel slowly, checking in all directions before fully exposing herself. The mist was still thick in this part of the valley, providing some concealment, but the helicopter could appear overhead at any moment. Sarah's radio crackled softly. "Mountain Bird, this is Base. We're tracking enemy air assets in your area. What's your status?" Sarah whispered into her radio. "Base, I'm mobile and concealed, but enemy has helicopter with thermal imaging. I've eliminated their ground commander and disabled their jamming equipment. Mission partially complete. Mountain Bird backup forces are 30 minutes out. Can you maintain position until then?" Sarah looked up at the sky where she could hear the helicopter circling. 30 minutes was a long time to stay hidden from both ground forces and aerial surveillance, but she had come this far and accomplished too much to give up now. Base, I'll maintain concealment and continue mission. Be advised, enemy forces are well-equipped and highly trained. This is more than a simple patrol. As Sarah ended her transmission, she heard voices approaching her position. A search team was moving systematically through this part of the village, checking every possible hiding place. She had to move again. Sarah began working her way toward the edge of the village, staying low and using every bit of cover available. The mist helped, but it also made it difficult to see obstacles or threats until she was very close to them. As she moved, Sarah began to piece together a plan. The enemy helicopter was their biggest advantage right now, but it was also their most vulnerable asset. Helicopters had to maintain certain flight patterns and altitudes to be effective, and a skilled marksman could potentially bring one down with the right shot. But taking a shot at a helicopter would require Sarah to expose her position completely. It would be a one-shot opportunity with no chance for a second attempt if she missed, and even if she succeeded, the ground forces would know exactly where she was. Sarah found a position near the edge of the village that gave her a clear view of the sky, while still providing some concealment. She unpacked her rifle and began calculating the variables involved in shooting at a moving aircraft. Wind speed, helicopter velocity, lead time. There were so many factors that could affect the shot. The helicopter appeared through the mist, flying a search pattern about 300 meters above the village. It was moving slowly, probably using thermal imaging to scan for heat signatures on the ground. Sarah tracked its movement through her scope, learning its pattern and timing. She noticed that the helicopter had to turn at the end of each search sweep, creating a moment when it was flying in a straight line and at a predictable speed. That would be her opportunity, but she would have to time it perfectly. Sarah's radio crackled again. Mountain bird, enemy reinforcements have been spotted approaching your area. Multiple vehicles, estimated arrival 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Sarah's backup was still 30 minutes away, but enemy reinforcements would arrive in 15. The situation was becoming more desperate by the minute. Sarah made her decision. She would take the shot at the helicopter during its next turn. It was risky, but eliminating their air support would level the playing field significantly, and if she could create enough chaos, she might be able to hold out until her backup arrived. The helicopter completed another sweep and began its turn. Sarah tracked it through her scope, leading the target just as she had been trained. The aircraft was moving exactly as she had predicted, following the same pattern it had used for the previous sweeps. Sarah controlled her breathing and prepared to take the most important shot of her life. The helicopter was in perfect position, flying straight and level as it completed its turn. She had a clear shot through a gap in the mist. As her finger began to squeeze the trigger, Sarah heard something that changed everything. The sound of vehicles approaching fast along the mountain road. The enemy reinforcements were arriving ahead of schedule, and they would reach the village within minutes. Sarah faced another impossible decision. Take the shot at the helicopter and reveal her position to the arriving reinforcements, or hold her fire and try to remain hidden until her own backup arrived. The helicopter completed its turn and began another search sweep. Sarah's window of opportunity was closing rapidly, and the sound of approaching vehicles was getting louder every second. Sarah made her choice in the split second before the helicopter disappeared back into the mist. She squeezed the trigger and her rifle kicked against her shoulder. Through the scope, she watched as her bullet struck the helicopter's tail rotor. The aircraft immediately began spinning out of control, black smoke trailing behind it as it struggled to maintain altitude. The helicopter pilot fought desperately to control his aircraft, but the damage was too severe. The helicopter crashed into the forest beyond the village with a thunderous explosion that echoed through the valley. The fireball was visible even through the thick mist, sending orange light dancing across the fog. But Sarah's victory was short-lived. The sound of her rifle shot had given away her position to every enemy soldier in the area, and the approaching vehicles were now racing toward her location. She could hear engines roaring as they accelerated up the mountain road. Sarah quickly packed her rifle and began moving toward higher ground. The crash site would draw attention away from her immediate area, but not for long. The enemy reinforcements would spread out and begin a systematic search, and without the mist to conceal her, she would be extremely vulnerable. As she climbed through the rocky terrain above the village, Sarah could hear the vehicles arriving below. Doors slammed, orders were shouted, and she could make out at least 3 different engines. That meant a significant number of additional enemy soldiers had just arrived. Her radio crackled with urgent transmissions. Mountain Bird, we saw the explosion. What happened? Base, I've eliminated enemy air support, but reinforcements have arrived. I'm moving to higher ground for better defensive position. Mountain Bird, our backup forces are 20 minutes out. Heavy weapons team is with them. Can you hold position until then? Sarah looked down at the village where she could see flashlights and vehicle lights moving through the mist. The enemy soldiers were organizing quickly, probably preparing to sweep the entire area. 20 minutes seemed like an impossibly long time. Base, I'll do my best. Be advised, enemy has significant ground forces now. This is going to be a firefight. As Sarah climbed higher up the mountainside, the mist began to thin. This gave her better visibility of the enemy positions below, but it also meant she would be more exposed to their view. She needed to find a defensive position that would allow her to engage multiple targets while providing adequate cover. She found what she was looking for about halfway up the ridge, a cluster of large boulders that formed a natural fortification. The position gave her a commanding view of the village and the approaches from the road, while the rocks provided protection from return fire. Sarah set up her rifle and began observing the enemy deployment. She counted at least 20 soldiers now, spread out in teams that were beginning to search the area systematically. They had professional equipment, including night vision goggles and advanced communication gear. Through her scope, Sarah could see the enemy commander directing the search operation. He was a different man than the one she had shot earlier, probably the leader of the reinforcement team. He was pointing toward different areas of the mountain, dividing his forces to cover all possible escape routes. Sarah realized that her position, while defensively strong, was also potentially a trap. If the enemy soldiers surrounded the boulder cluster, she would have nowhere to retreat. But she also knew that her backup forces would need time to reach her position, and someone had to slow down the enemy advance. The first search team began moving up the mountain toward her position. They were advancing carefully, using proper tactical movements and cover. These were definitely professional soldiers, not the kind of enemies that could be easily fooled or frightened. Sarah waited until the team was well within range before taking her first shot. The lead soldier dropped immediately, and the rest of the team scattered for cover. But instead of retreating, they began working to flank her position, moving with the kind of coordination that spoke of extensive training. Sarah's radio came alive with chatter. Mountain Bird, we're picking up your muzzle flashes on satellite. Enemy forces are converging on your position from multiple directions. Through her scope, Sarah could see what the satellite was showing. Enemy soldiers were moving up the mountain from 3 different directions, effectively surrounding her position. They were taking their time, moving carefully and using their superior numbers to their advantage. Sarah began engaging targets as they presented themselves, but for every soldier she stopped, 2 more seemed to take his place. Her ammunition was limited, and she was facing an enemy force that significantly outnumbered her. As the situation became more desperate, Sarah heard a new sound that gave her hope, the distant rumble of heavy vehicles approaching from the opposite direction. Her backup forces were finally arriving, and they were bringing the heavy weapons team that could turn the tide of the battle. But the enemy had heard the approaching vehicles too, and they increased the intensity of their assault. Sarah found herself under heavy fire from multiple directions as the enemy soldiers tried to eliminate her before her reinforcements could arrive. Bullets struck the rocks around her, sending chips of stone flying through the air. Sarah had to keep moving within her defensive position, firing from different angles to avoid being pinned down by concentrated fire. Her rifle was hot from rapid firing, and her ammunition supply was running dangerously low. Through the chaos of the firefight, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of her own force's vehicles arriving in the valley below. She could make out the heavier engines of armored personnel carriers and the unique sound signature of the mounted weapons systems. Her radio crackled through the gunfire. Mountain Bird, this is Hammer Team. We're in position and can see your defensive position. We're going to lay down suppressing fire to give you a chance to reposition. Sarah looked down at the valley and saw muzzle flashes erupting from her backup forces' positions. Heavy machine gun fire began raking the mountainside, forcing the enemy soldiers to seek cover and disrupting their coordinated assault on her position. Hammer Team, this is Mountain Bird. I'm taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Enemy forces are well equipped and coordinated. I'm running low on ammunition. Mountain Bird, we're moving up to support your position. Hold on for 2 more minutes. 2 minutes. Sarah checked her remaining ammunition and counted her targets. She had perhaps a dozen rounds left, and at least that many enemy soldiers were still actively engaging her position. Every shot would have to count. As the heavy weapons team continued their suppressing fire, Sarah noticed that some of the enemy soldiers were trying to withdraw toward their vehicles. They were apparently deciding that the mission was no longer worth the casualties they were taking, but the enemy commander was not giving up so easily. Sarah could see him through her scope, rallying his men and pointing toward her position. He was determined to eliminate her before retreating, probably understanding that she had seen too much of their operation to be allowed to escape. Sarah lined up a shot on the enemy commander, but before she could fire, she heard something that made her freeze, the sound of another helicopter approaching. The enemy had called for additional air support, and this time they would be ready for ground fire. The new helicopter appeared through the mist, flying much higher than the previous aircraft and using evasive maneuvers. Sarah could see that it was heavily armed, with mounted weapon systems that could devastate her position and her backup forces below. But as the helicopter moved into position to engage, Sarah heard a different sound, the whistle of incoming artillery. Her backup forces had brought more than just heavy weapons. They had called in artillery support, and the first rounds were already incoming. The artillery shells struck the enemy positions in the village with devastating accuracy. Explosions rocked the valley as the enemy command center and vehicle positions were systematically destroyed. The helicopter pilot, seeing his ground support being eliminated, began to retreat toward safer territory. Sarah used the chaos caused by the artillery barrage to take her shot at the enemy commander. Through her scope, she saw him fall as her bullet found its target. With their leader down and their positions under heavy bombardment, the remaining enemy soldiers began a full retreat. The firefight that had seemed so desperate just minutes earlier was suddenly turning in Sarah's favor. Her backup forces were advancing up the mountain, and the enemy was in full retreat, but Sarah knew that her mission was not complete. Until every enemy soldier was accounted for and the intelligence threat was fully neutralized. As the artillery barrage ended and the sound of gunfire faded, Sarah heard her radio crackle with a familiar voice. "Mountain Bird, this is Hammer Team Leader. We're moving to your position. Outstanding work up there." Sarah allowed herself a moment of relief as she watched the last enemy vehicle disappear down the mountain road. She had survived one of the most challenging missions of her career, and more importantly, she had protected the civilian evacuation routes and prevented a major intelligence breach. But even as the immediate threat ended, Sarah knew that this had been just one battle in a larger conflict. The enemy had shown sophisticated capabilities and determination that suggested this would not be their last attempt. The war was far from over, but for now the mountain pass was secure. 3 hours after the last gunshot echoed through the valley, Sarah sat in the back of an armored personnel carrier, finally allowing herself to process what had happened. The medic had checked her for injuries and declared her fit for duty, though she had numerous small cuts from flying rock chips and was exhausted from the hours of intense combat. Lieutenant Martinez sat across from her, reviewing the after-action reports and debriefing information. His expression was unreadable, and Sarah knew she would face serious questions about her decision to leave her assigned position and engage the enemy without authorization. "Sergeant Chen," Martinez began, using her formal rank instead of her call sign, "your actions today were simultaneously the most reckless and most effective operation I've seen in 15 years of military service." Sarah straightened up, preparing for whatever disciplinary action was coming. "Sir, I understand that I violated orders by leaving my assigned position. I take full responsibility for my actions." Martinez looked at her for a long moment before continuing. "Your unauthorized reconnaissance mission led to the discovery of a major enemy intelligence operation. Your single-handed engagement of superior forces prevented them from intercepting our communications and compromising the civilian evacuation, and your elimination of their command structure likely saved hundreds of lives." Sarah waited for the but that she knew was coming. "But," Martinez continued, You also put yourself and potentially your entire unit at risk by acting without support or authorization. What you did today could have gone very wrong in dozens of different ways. Yes, sir. I understand that. Martinez pulled out a folder and opened it on his lap. The intelligence you gathered about enemy capabilities has been forwarded to division headquarters. They're very interested in the sophisticated equipment and coordination you observed. This was definitely not a routine patrol. Sarah nodded. The soldiers I engaged were highly trained, sir. Professional military, probably special forces. Their equipment was advanced and their tactical coordination was excellent, which makes what you accomplished even more remarkable, Martinez said, taking out their helicopter with a single shot, eliminating their command structure, and holding a defensive position against superior numbers until backup arrived. These are the kinds of actions that military historians write about. Sarah felt a mix of pride and unease. She had done her job, but she had also taken enormous risks that could have ended very differently. Martinez closed the folder and looked directly at her. There will be an official investigation into your actions as required by regulations. But I want you to know that I'll be recommending you for the Distinguished Service Cross. Your courage and skill under fire were extraordinary. Sarah was stunned. The Distinguished Service Cross was one of the highest military honors, awarded for exceptional heroism in combat. She had never imagined that her desperate attempts to complete her mission would be considered for such recognition. Sir, I was just doing my job. I saw a threat to our forces and the civilians we're protecting, and I responded to that threat. Sergeant, that's exactly what courage is. Doing your job when doing your job means risking everything to protect others. The personnel carrier began to slow down as they approached the base camp. Through the small window, Sarah could see other soldiers gathered around, obviously waiting for news about the mission. Word had already spread about the dramatic firefight in the mountain valley. Martinez gathered his papers and prepared to exit the vehicle. Take some time to rest and recover, Sergeant. There will be more debriefings tomorrow, and probably visits from intelligence officers who want to hear every detail about what you observed. As they exited the personnel carrier, Sarah was surprised to see a group of soldiers waiting to greet her. These were her fellow squad members, the people she worked with every day, and their faces showed a mixture of respect and amazement. Corporal Williams, one of the communication specialists, stepped forward. Sergeant Chen, we heard what happened up there. That was incredible. Sarah felt uncomfortable with the attention. I just did what needed to be done. The real heroes were the backup forces who came to get me out of there. Don't be modest, Williams replied. You took on an entire enemy company by yourself and won. That's going to be talked about for years. As Sarah made her way through the crowd of well-wishers, she thought about the events of the day. She had started the morning as a communications specialist who had made an unauthorized decision to conduct reconnaissance. She was ending it as someone who had potentially changed the course of a military operation and saved countless lives. But more than the recognition or the potential medal, Sarah felt satisfied that she had lived up to her training and her responsibilities as a soldier. When faced with a threat to her fellow soldiers and innocent civilians, she had responded with courage and skill. Later that evening, as Sarah sat in her quarters writing her detailed after-action report, she received a message that made her pause. It was from the commander of the civilian evacuation operation, thanking her for her actions. The message mentioned that over 400 civilians had safely reached the evacuation zones because the enemy intelligence operation had been disrupted. 100 lives. Sarah had never thought of her mission in those terms, but now she understood the true impact of what had happened in the misty mountain valley. Her decision to step through the fog with her rifle had protected people she would never meet. People whose only crime was being in the wrong place when conflict erupted. As she finished her report, Sarah looked out the window at the mountain ridge where her adventure had begun. The mist had cleared and she could see the valley where so much had happened in such a short time. Tomorrow there would be more missions, more challenges, and more opportunities to serve. But tonight, Sarah Chen, the sniper who had walked through the mist to face impossible odds, allowed herself to feel proud of what she had accomplished. She had proven that sometimes one person, in the right place at the right time with the right skills and the courage to use them, could make all the difference in the world. The war would continue, but because of her actions, it would continue with 400 more people safely away from the fighting, and with an enemy intelligence operation that would take months to rebuild. In the grand scheme of a larger conflict, it might seem like a small victory. But to Sarah and to the people whose lives she had saved, it was everything.